March 1974. The world had already moved on. Nearly 3 decades had passed since the guns of World War II fell silent. Cities had been rebuilt. Children had grown into parents. Nations that once hated each other were trading, traveling, and trying to forget the nightmare of war. But deep inside the wild jungle of Lubang Island in the Philippines, one man still believed the war was raging. His uniform was torn into strips. His boots were barely holding together. Rain had rusted everything around him, but one thing remained untouched: his rifle, clean, ready, loaded. Every morning he woke like a soldier on active duty. Every night he slept like the enemy was one step away. He moved through the jungle like a ghost, silent, watching, waiting. For 29 years, he refused to believe Japan had surrendered. He refused to believe peace had come, and he refused to lay down his weapon. While the rest of the world lived in 1974, his mind was trapped in 1945. His name was Hiroo Onoda. Some called him loyal. Some called him insane. Others believed he was already dead. But the real question is far more disturbing. How can one man live alone in a jungle for nearly 30 years, fighting a war that ended long ago? How powerful must obedience be to defeat time itself? Because this is not just the story of a forgotten soldier. This is the story of a man who disappeared into war and never came back. Hiroo Onoda was born in 1922 in Japan, in a country very different from the modern Japan people know today. This was not the Japan of technology, fast trains, and glowing city lights. This was an empire driven by discipline, sacrifice, and military pride. From childhood, boys were raised to serve. Honor was everything. Weakness was shameful. Surrender was worse than death. Children were taught stories of warriors who died smiling for their emperor. Loyalty was not a choice, it was a duty. Onoda grew up in that world. He was intelligent, serious, and physically strong, but more than anything, he absorbed the values around him. To question orders was desirable. To fail was humiliating. To surrender was unthinkable. As he became a young man, Japan was expanding through Asia. War was spreading. Soldiers were treated like heroes. Military service was considered noble. So when the empire called, Onoda answered. But fate had a different path waiting for him. Instead of becoming an ordinary infantry soldier, he was selected for special training. He was sent to Nakano Military School, where elite officers were trained in intelligence and guerrilla warfare. This was not normal soldier training. Here he learned sabotage, espionage, survival, how to live off the land, how to disappear, how to strike without warning, how to make a small group feel like an army, and most importantly, he was taught that enemy information could never be trusted. Leaflets, radio broadcasts, captured messages, all of it could be deception. Trust only your commanding officer. Trust only direct orders. That lesson would shape the rest of his life. In late 1944, Japan was losing the war badly. American forces were advancing across the Pacific. Island after island was falling. Desperation was growing. Onoda was sent to Lubang Island in the Philippines with a mission: disrupt enemy landings, destroy airfields, harass supply lines, and never surrender. Before he left, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi gave him a final command. No matter what happens, you are forbidden to give up your life voluntarily. You are forbidden to surrender. It may take 3 years, it may take 5, but we will come back for you. Those words became law inside Onoda's mind. He landed on Lubang at just 22 years old. He had no idea he was stepping into a prison made of loyalty. Soon after, American forces captured the island. Japanese defenses collapsed quickly. Then came August 1945. The atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered. World War II was over, but not for Hiroo Onoda. Leaflets were dropped across the jungle. The war has ended.
Japan has surrendered. Come down from the mountains." But Onoda studied the papers and shook his head. Fake. Enemy propaganda. Exactly what he had been trained to expect. Why would he trust papers dropped by the enemy? Why would he believe voices coming from strangers? His commander promised to return. Until that happened, the mission continued. And with that decision, a new war began. Onoda was not alone at first. 3 other Japanese soldiers remained with him. Together, they disappeared into the jungle. They built hidden camps. They stole rice from farms. They ate bananas, coconuts, and whatever they could hunt. They repaired uniforms with scraps. They cleaned their rifles obsessively. Every sound in the night could be danger. Every farmer could be a spy. Every plane overhead could mean invasion. They watched the world change from a distance, but interpreted everything through war. When they saw local people farming peacefully, they believed it was enemy support activity. When they found newspapers describing post-war Japan, they thought it was fabricated. When they saw modern clothing and products, they believed it was staged deception. Their minds had become a fortress. Nothing outside could enter. Years passed. Rain seasons came and went. Trees grew taller. Children were born and became adults. Still, the soldiers hid. But time attacks everyone. One of the men, Akatsu, grew tired and surrendered in 1949. The others saw him as weak. Then, in 1954, another companion, Shimada, was killed during a clash with search parties. Now, only 2 remained, Onoda and Kinshichi Kozutsuka.
They continued raids for years. They burned crops, stole supplies, fired at locals and police. To the people of Lubang, they were not forgotten soldiers. They were a nightmare in the forest. More than 30 civilians were killed over the decades, and many others were wounded. For villagers, peace had returned in theory, but danger still lived in the jungle. Search teams came many times. Japanese officials called out with loudspeakers. Family members sent letters. Photographs were dropped from aircraft. Messages begged him to come home. But Onoda examined everything like an intelligence officer. Could photographs be forged? Could voices be imitated? Could relatives be forced by the enemy? His answer was always the same: yes. So he stayed hidden. That is what makes this story terrifying. He was not surviving because he lacked evidence. He was surviving because no evidence could break the belief already inside him. Years turned into decades. His hair grayed, his face hardened, his body aged in silence. But in his mind, he was still a young officer waiting for orders. Then came 1972. Kozuka, his last companion, was killed by local police during an attempted raid. For the first time in nearly 30 years, Hiroo Onoda was completely alone. One man, one rifle, one mission, one illusion. The world now knew he was still alive. News spread across Japan. Some were amazed, some were embarrassed, some pitied him, but nobody knew how to bring him back. Then, a young traveler named Norio Suzuki entered the story. Suzuki was not a soldier. He was an adventurer with wild dreams. He reportedly said he wanted to find 3 things: a panda, the abominable snowman, and Lieutenant Onoda, in that order. People laughed. Governments had failed for decades. Military teams had failed. Search parties had failed. But Suzuki walked into the jungle with almost no fear, and within days, he found him. Imagine that moment, a young traveler standing face to face with a man frozen in wartime, a ghost with a rifle. Suzuki called out in Japanese, "Onoda-san, the emperor and the people of Japan are worried about you." Onoda did not shoot. He listened. They spoke. Suzuki explained everything. Japan had changed. The war was over. The empire was gone. The country was peaceful and prosperous. But Onoda remained firm. He would not surrender to words. He would only obey one man, his commanding officer, Major Taniguchi.
That was the lock, and only one key existed. Japan searched for Taniguchi. The officer who once sent him to war was no longer in uniform. He had become a civilian, working an ordinary job, far removed from battlefields and imperial dreams. But here's the twist no one expected. The man who started the mission had to come back personally to end it. In March 1974, Taniguchi traveled to Lubang Island. When Onoda saw him, he snapped to attention like no time had passed, not 30 years, not one day. The old commander read formal orders. Japan had lost the war. All combat activity must cease. You are relieved of duty. Surrender your weapons. Just like that, the spell was broken. The war inside Hiroo Onoda finally ended. He stepped out of the jungle wearing a faded uniform. He handed over his rifle, ammunition, sword, and dagger. Amazingly, many of his weapons were still functional. He was now 52 years old. He had entered the jungle at 22. He gave away his youth to an order. Imagine losing 30 years not to prison, not to injury, but to belief. Japan welcomed him home as a symbol of dedication. Crowds gathered, reporters surrounded him. Some praised his loyalty and discipline. Others questioned the deaths caused during his raids. He himself expressed regret for lives lost. But celebration could not hide another tragedy. The Japan he returned to no longer existed. The old empire was gone. Modern buildings rose everywhere. Western culture was visible. Young people lived differently. The values he sacrificed everything for had changed. He had survived the jungle, but he could not easily survive the future. Feeling out of place, Onoda later moved to Brazil, where he worked on a ranch and tried to build a calmer life. Years later, he returned to Lubang Island and donated money to help local communities, hoping in some way to heal old wounds. He wrote books, gave interviews, reflected on duty, war, and memory. In 2014, Hiroo Onoda died at the age of 91. And with him went one of the strangest human stories ever recorded. Because what happened to Onoda was bigger than war. It was about identity. If a person spends his whole life being told duty is everything, what happens when duty becomes a cage? If obedience becomes absolute, when does loyalty turn into tragedy? Some people call him a hero. Some call him a victim. Some call him dangerous. Maybe he was all three. He did not lose 30 years because he was foolish. He lost them because he believed completely. And complete belief can be more powerful than chains. The jungle on Lubang Island was filled with trees, mud, insects, and darkness. But the real jungle was inside his mind. That is where he remained trapped. While nations rebuilt, while children became grandparents, while history moved on, one man waited for an order that came 30 years too late. Hiroo Onoda may have been the last soldier of World War II, but he was also something even sadder, a man who won the battle of obedience and lost the war of life.